Title: The Metabolic Blueprint: Breaking the Genetic Curse. For decades, families have watched type 2 diabetes move through generations like a grim inheritance, accepting it as an unavoidable fate. But cutting-edge research into epigenetics has exposed a startling truth. Your DNA is not your destiny, it is merely a suggestion. While your genes may load the weapon, your environment pulls the trigger. We are about to dismantle the physiological mechanisms of insulin resistance, handing you the precise controls to override your own biology. The journey to preventing this silent killer starts by confronting its primary physical stronghold.
Maintain a healthy weight, especially belly fat. To understand the catastrophic impact of excess weight on the human metabolic system, one must first strip away the cosmetic and societal implications of obesity and view the condition through the cold, uncompromising lens of cellular biology. For decades, the medical community viewed adipose tissue, body fat, as merely a passive storage depot, a benign warehouse where the body kept excess energy for a rainy day that in the modern world rarely comes. This was a fundamental misunderstanding that set diabetes prevention back by half a century. We now know through rigorous endocrine research that fat tissue, specifically visceral adiposity, is not a warehouse, it is an active, aggressive biological organ. It is a rogue gland that engages in a form of chemical warfare against the host body. When we discuss maintaining a healthy weight to prevent type 2 diabetes, we are not talking about fitting into a smaller pair of jeans. We are talking about dismantling a siege engine that is actively bombarding your pancreas and liver with inflammatory signals. The distinction between subcutaneous fat, the pinchable fat under the skin, and visceral fat, the deep, firm fat surrounding the organs, is the most critical concept in metabolic health. Visceral fat wraps itself around the intestines, the liver, and the pancreas like a strangling vine. Unlike the relatively inert subcutaneous fat, visceral fat is metabolically hyperactive. It secretes a torrent of hormones and inflammatory cytokines, including interleukin-6, IL-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha, TNF-alpha. These chemicals disrupt the body's insulin signaling pathways. Imagine insulin as a key trying to unlock a cell door to let glucose inside for energy. Visceral fat essentially gums up the lock. The key enters, but it won't turn. This is the genesis of insulin resistance. The pancreas, sensing that the cells are still starving for energy and that blood sugar remains high, works overtime to produce more keys, more insulin. This state of hyperinsulinemia can persist for years, silently eroding the body's infrastructure long before a doctor diagnoses diabetes. The tragedy is that this war is often invisible to the naked eye. A person can appear relatively thin but harbor dangerous amounts of visceral fat, a condition medically known as TOFI, thin outside, fat inside.
The evolutionary context of this struggle provides a haunting backdrop to our modern predicament. For 99% of human history, calories were scarce. The human body evolved a thrifty genotype, a survival mechanism designed to aggressively hoard energy when food was available to survive the inevitable famines that followed. We are the descendants of the best fat stores. However, in the last 50 years, a mere blink in the evolutionary timeline, we have engineered an environment of caloric ubiquity. We are biologically programmed for a world of scarcity while living in a world of infinite abundance. This evolutionary mismatch is the engine driving the diabetes epidemic. When a person with a genetic predisposition to diabetes gains weight, particularly around the midsection, they are essentially overloading a system designed for a different era. The personal fat threshold hypothesis suggests that every individual has a genetically determined limit to how much fat their subcutaneous cells can expand to hold. Once that limit is breached, fat spills over into the visceral cavity and into organs where it doesn't belong, specifically the liver and the pancreas. This spillover effect is where the mechanics of prevention become critical. When fat accumulates in the liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, the liver becomes insulin resistant. The liver is the body's glucose manager. Normally, insulin tells the liver to stop pumping sugar into the blood during a meal, but a fatty insulin-resistant liver ignores this signal and continues to dump glucose into the bloodstream even when you are eating, causing a double spike in blood sugar. This is why waist circumference is a far more potent predictor of type 2 diabetes risk than body mass index, BMI. A waist measurement greater than 40 inches for men or 35 inches for women indicates that the visceral storage depots are full and the metabolic spillover has begun. The apple shape is not just a body type, it is a visible warning sign of metabolic distress. However, the investigative data offers a beacon of immense hope rooted in the concept of the 5 to 10% solution. The daunting prospect of returning to a high school weight often paralyzes patients, causing them to abandon efforts before they begin. Yet clinical trials, including the landmark Diabetes Prevention Program, DPP, have proven that massive weight loss is not required to halt the progression of the disease.
Losing just 5 to 10% of total body weight, a manageable goal for most, can reduce the risk of developing type 2 diabetes by nearly 60%. This disproportionate benefit occurs because the body is incredibly efficient at mobilizing visceral fat first. When a person begins a caloric deficit and increases movement, the body burns the dangerous, metabolically active fat around the organs before it touches the subcutaneous stores. The first few pounds lost are the most medically significant. By reducing the pressure on the liver and pancreas, insulin sensitivity can snap back with surprising speed. The 5-10% rule is the metabolic reset button. What to do when weight is rising fast is a question of immediate tactical intervention. Rapid weight gain is often a sign that the insulin feedback loop is broken. High insulin levels lock fat in the cells and prevent it from being burned, creating a state of constant hunger and storage. To break this cycle, one must look beyond simple calorie counting and address the hormonal drivers of weight gain. This involves a radical reduction in liquid calories. Sugary drinks are the most efficient delivery system for visceral fat accumulation known to man, and a recalibration of portion sizes. But perhaps the most overlooked weapon in this arsenal is the daily walk. While high-intensity exercise has its place, low-intensity steady-state movement, like walking, is uniquely effective at burning fat as fuel without spiking cortisol, stress hormone levels, which can otherwise trigger belly fat storage. The protocol for prevention is not about starving the body, but about signaling safety to it. It is about convincing the ancient survival-driven gene code that the famine is not coming and that the body can safely release its emergency reserves. This journey of weight management requires a shift in psychological framing. We must move away from the aesthetic motivation of weight loss, which is fragile and often leads to failure, towards a medical motivation. The goal is to de-fat the internal organs. Every inch lost from the waistline is a measurable reduction in the inflammatory cytokine load circulating in the blood. It is a direct de-escalation of the biological warfare occurring within the abdomen. The science is clear. The fat cell is the command center of type 2 diabetes, and shrinking that cell is the most effective way to cut the communication lines of the disease.
The process of losing 5 to 10% of body weight is an act of reclaiming physiological autonomy, stepping back from the precipice of chronic illness, and rewriting the genetic narrative that has plagued families for generations.
2. Cut back on sugar and refined carbs. If visceral fat is the siege engine, then sugar and refined carbohydrates are the ammunition that keeps the war going. To investigate the role of refined carbohydrates in the onset of type 2 diabetes is to investigate the history of modern industrialization and the fundamental alteration of the human food supply. For millennia, carbohydrates came wrapped in a protective matrix of fiber. Roots, tubers, fruits, and grains were tough, fibrous, and required significant digestive effort to break down. This fiber acted as a natural brake, slowing the absorption of glucose into the bloodstream and allowing the pancreas to release insulin in a controlled, rhythmic manner. The modern food industry, in its quest for palatability and shelf life, stripped away this fiber, isolating the starch and the sugar. The result is a food supply that functions less like nutrition and more like a drug delivery system, injecting glucose into the bloodstream with a velocity that the human body was never designed to handle. When you consume refined carbohydrates, white bread, white rice, pasta, soda, pastries, you are essentially bypassing the body's natural digestive gating mechanisms. These foods have a high glycemic index, GI, meaning they convert to blood glucose almost instantly. The moment a piece of white bread hits your tongue, the enzyme amylase begins breaking it down into sugar. By the time it reaches the small intestine, it is a flood of pure glucose. This results in a massive, vertical spike in blood sugar. The pancreas, detecting this toxic level of glucose, which damages blood vessels if left unchecked, panics. It dumps a massive bolus of insulin into the system to shove that sugar into cells. This is the spike. What follows is the crash. The excessive insulin clears the sugar so effectively that blood glucose levels plummet, leading to reactive hypoglycemia. This crash triggers intense cravings for more sugar, creating a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle of spike, crash, crave that exhausts the pancreas and desensitizes the cells to insulin. The villainy of sugar, particularly fructose, requires a specific and deep chemical interrogation. While every cell in the body can use glucose for energy, only the liver can process fructose, the molecule that makes sugar sweet. When we consume sucrose, table sugar, or high fructose corn syrup, HFCS, we are hitting the liver with a heavy metabolic burden.
If the liver is already full of glycogen, stored energy, it has no choice but to convert this excess fructose directly into fat through a process called de novo lipogenesis. This fat is not stored on the hips or thighs, it is stored in the liver itself. This is the direct causal link between sugary drinks and fatty liver disease, which, as previously established, is the precursor to type 2 diabetes. We are effectively marinating our livers in sugar, turning them into foie gras. The investigation into the sugar industry reveals a concerted effort in the latter half of the 20th century to deflect blame onto dietary fat, leading to the low-fat craze of the 1980s and 90s. To make low-fat food palatable, manufacturers replaced fat with sugar and refined starches. The result was a catastrophic explosion in diabetes rates that correlates perfectly with the introduction of the low-fat dietary guidelines.
The neurobiology of sugar consumption adds a terrifying layer to this preventative strategy. Research using fMRI scans has shown that sugar lights up the nucleus accumbens, the brain's reward center, in the exact same manner as cocaine or heroin. It triggers a dopamine release that overrides the body's satiety signals. You can be physically full after a large meal, but if a slice of cake is placed in front of you, your brain creates room for it. This is not a lack of willpower, it is a hijacked neurotransmitter system. Preventing diabetes in a family with a genetic history means acknowledging that sugar is an addictive substance. The moderation strategy often fails because it keeps the addiction pathways open. For many, the most effective prevention is a rigorous detoxification, cutting the feedback loop entirely until the brain's dopamine receptors reset and the cravings for hyperpalatable foods subside. This usually takes 2 to 4 weeks of discomfort, a withdrawal period that must be endured to secure long-term metabolic freedom. The practical application of cutting back requires a forensic analysis of one's diet. Sugar is the master of disguise. It hides in savory foods, pasta sauces, salad dressings, breads, crackers, and condiments under dozens of different names: dextrose, maltodextrin, cane juice, rice syrup. A truly preventative diet involves reading labels with the scrutiny of a detective. It means understanding that a bowl of healthy granola can contain as much sugar as a candy bar.
The shift must be toward complex carbohydrates, foods where the fiber matrix is intact. Quinoa, legumes, steel-cut oats, and whole vegetables do not cause the violent spikes associated with refined grains. They provide a slow, steady release of energy, keeping insulin levels low and stable. This flat line of blood sugar is the holy grail of diabetes prevention. However, we must also address the immediate tactical response to a carbohydrate overdose. We are human, and in a social world, deviations from the diet occur. The instruction, if you overeat carbs, take a 10-20-minute walk, is based on the physiology of the GLUT4 transporter. Normally, insulin is required to open the cell door for glucose. However, muscle contraction, the physical act of moving your muscles, can activate a backdoor mechanism. When muscles contract, they can pull glucose out of the bloodstream without the need for insulin. This is a profound discovery. It means that a brisk walk immediately after a high-carb meal can blunt the blood sugar spike by up to 30 to 50%. You are physically burning off the glucose tsunami before it has a chance to damage your system or trigger an insulin flood. This technique transforms exercise from a general healthy habit into a targeted surgical tool for glucose management. The cultural implications of rejecting refined carbohydrates are immense. It involves swimming upstream against a food environment designed to make you sick. It means rejecting the beige diet of the modern Western world and returning to a diet of color and texture. It requires a re-education of the palate, learning to appreciate the subtle sweetness of a blueberry or a roasted carrot, rather than the blinding, artificial sweetness of a soda. This dietary shift is the most powerful epigenetic signal you can send to your body. By removing the constant bombardment of glucose, you allow the pancreas to rest. You allow the insulin receptors to upregulate and become sensitive again. You stop the glycation process, the sugar coating of proteins that causes the stiffening of arteries and the aging of tissues. Ultimately, cutting sugar and refined carbs is not a diet. It is a metabolic defense strategy. It is the recognition that in the genetic lottery of type 2 diabetes, refined carbohydrates are the catalyst that turns a predisposition into a diagnosis. By controlling the input of glucose, you control the output of insulin. You silence the inflammatory signals.
You protect the liver. In the grand investigation of human health, the evidence is irrefutable. The white powders of the modern pantry, sugar and flour, are the primary culprits in the metabolic collapse of the industrialized world. Eliminating them is the single most effective action an individual can take to break the chain of hereditary diabetes and secure a future of vitality rather than decline. The power is not in the genes, the power is on the plate. 3. Add fiber to every meal. To understand the profound metabolic crisis of the 21st century, we must investigate a disappearance. It is not a disappearance of food. Calories are more abundant than at any point in human history, but rather the systematic erasure of the architectural framework that once held our nutrition together: fiber. For millions of years, the human digestive tract evolved to process complex fibrous plant matter. Our ancestors did not drink their calories, they chewed them, grinding through tubers, roots, fibrous fruits, and rough leaves. They consumed an estimated 100 to 150 grams of fiber daily. Today, the average American struggles to consume 15 grams. This fiber gap is not merely a dietary deficiency, it is a catastrophic environmental change for our internal biology, a missing piece of the puzzle that has left our metabolic engines exposed, unregulated, and prone to the runaway overheating we call type 2 diabetes. Fiber is often dismissed as mere roughage, a passive substance that simply helps with regularity. This reductive view ignores the biochemical sophistication of this nutrient. In the context of diabetes prevention, fiber functions as the body's internal traffic control system.
When we consume carbohydrates without fiber, think of fruit juice, white bread, or sugary snacks. Glucose enters the bloodstream with the force of a breaking dam. There is no resistance, no barrier. The blood sugar spikes vertically, forcing the pancreas to deploy emergency levels of insulin. However, when carbohydrates are consumed in their natural fiber-rich matrix, the physiology changes entirely. Soluble fiber found in oats, beans, and the flesh of many fruits dissolves in water to form a viscous gel-like substance in the stomach. This gel physically entraps glucose molecules, slowing their transit into the small intestine. It transforms the sugar flood into a manageable trickle. This is the difference between a flash flood that destroys the riverbanks and a steady rain that nourishes the soil. By adding fiber to every meal, you are essentially rebuilding the dam that industrial food processing destroyed. The investigation into fiber leads us deep into the microscopic world of the gut microbiome, a frontier of science that is redefining our understanding of metabolic health. We are not just feeding ourselves, we are feeding the trillions of bacteria that reside in our colon. These bacteria are the gatekeepers of our metabolism.
And their preferred fuel source is fermentable fiber. When we starve them of fiber, the good bacteria die off and the gut lining degrades, leading to systemic inflammation, a root cause of insulin resistance. However, when we feed these microbes with diverse plant fibers, they engage in a process called saccharolytic fermentation. The byproduct of this fermentation is a class of molecules known as short-chain fatty acids, SCFAs, the most famous of which is butyrate. Butyrate is a miracle molecule in the fight against diabetes. It serves as the primary fuel source for the cells lining the colon, keeping the gut barrier intact and preventing endotoxins from leaking into the bloodstream. But its reach extends far beyond the gut. Once absorbed, butyrate travels to the brain, the liver, and the pancreas. It improves insulin sensitivity at a cellular level and suppresses the production of glucose by the liver. It effectively tells the body that it is fed and safe. Without fiber, this internal pharmacy shuts down. The modern low-fiber diet effectively creates a famine for our microbiome, turning our own gut bacteria from symbiotic allies into inflammatory enemies. The correlation between the decline in fiber consumption and the rise in type 2 diabetes is almost a perfect inverse line. As we removed the husk from the grain, we unlocked the disease. There is also a profound hormonal component to fiber that rivals modern pharmaceuticals. In recent years, drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy, GLP-1 agonists, have dominated the headlines for their ability to control blood sugar and induce weight loss. These drugs work by mimicking a natural hormone called glucagon-like peptide-1, GLP-1. What is often left out of the pharmaceutical narrative is that the body is designed to produce its own GLP-1, and the trigger for this production is fiber. When L cells in the lower intestine detect the presence of undigested fiber and short-chain fatty acids, they release GLP-1. This hormone travels to the brain to signal satiety, stopping you from overeating, and to the pancreas to enhance insulin secretion. By adding fiber to every meal, you are naturally stimulating the very pathway that billion-dollar drugs attempt to hijack. You are utilizing the body's endogenous technology to regulate its own energy balance. The historical context of fiber's removal is a story of industrial convenience triumphing over human health. In the late 19th century, with the invention of the steel roller mill, humanity figured out how to efficiently strip the bran and germ from wheat, leaving only the starchy endosperm. This created white flour that was shelf-stable, resistant to pests, and soft to the palate. It was an economic miracle and a nutritional disaster. We democratized luxury. White bread was once the food of aristocrats, but in doing so, we democratized diabetes. We removed the brakes from our food supply. Reintroducing fiber is therefore an act of rebellion against the industrial food system. It requires a conscious shift away from the beige diet of processed convenience and toward a diet of complexity and texture. It means choosing the steel-cut oat over the instant packet, the whole apple over the juice, the lentil stew over the macaroni. Practically, the implementation of adding fiber to every meal requires a strategic approach known as preloading. The sequence in which we eat our food matters as much as the food itself. Research has demonstrated that eating the fibrous portion of a meal first, the salad, the roasted vegetables, the beans, creates the physical mesh in the stomach before the starches and sugars arrive. This is the veggie starter strategy. If you eat a bowl of pasta followed by a salad, the glucose from the pasta hits the bloodstream first. If you eat the salad before the pasta, the fiber from the vegetables coats the lining of the upper intestine and mixes with the pasta in the stomach, significantly blunting the glucose spike. This tactical eating can reduce the post-meal blood sugar response by 30 to 40%, a magnitude of effect similar to some diabetic medications. However, the modern palate is often unaccustomed to high fiber intake, and the transition can be physically uncomfortable. A sudden jump from 10 grams to 40 grams of fiber can cause bloating and distress as the microbiome struggles to adapt. The protocol, therefore, is gradual escalation. If you feel hungry too soon, increase fiber first before adding more carbs. This instruction is a corrective mechanism for the energy crash. Hunger shortly after a meal is usually a sign that the meal was too rapidly absorbed, leading to a hypoglycemic dip. The solution is not more quick energy, but slower energy. By adding chia seeds to yogurt, flaxseed to smoothies, or a cup of broccoli to dinner, you are extending the energy curve. You are turning a flash fire into a slow burn.
Furthermore,
Fiber requires the mechanical act of chewing. Highly processed foods are designed to be eaten quickly. They practically melt in the mouth, a phenomenon food scientists call vanishing caloric density. Fiber fights back. It requires mastication. This physical act of chewing stimulates the vagus nerve and gives the brain time to register satiety signals. It forces a pause. In a culture of rushed eating, fiber demands a slowing down. It reconnects the eater to the act of eating. Ultimately, fiber is the anchor of metabolic health. It ties the sugar to digestion, the gut to the brain, and the human to the soil. In the fight against genetic predisposition to diabetes, fiber is the most powerful tool we have to modulate the environment in which our genes express themselves. It is the buffer, the regulator, and the healer. By ensuring that every meal contains this crucial element, we are not just aiding digestion, we are sending a complex chemical signal to our ancient genome that the environment is safe, that resources are stable, and that the metabolic panic of insulin resistance is unnecessary.
4. Prioritize protein to reduce cravings. If fiber is the traffic controller of the metabolic system, protein is the architect and the foreman. In the hierarchy of macronutrients, protein commands a unique authority over the human drive to eat. To understand why prioritizing protein is essential for preventing type 2 diabetes, we must delve into the protein leverage hypothesis, a groundbreaking concept in nutritional science proposed by ecologists David Robbenheimer and Stephen Simpson. Their research suggests that the drive for protein is the primary appetite mechanism in humans. Our bodies have a specific protein target that they are genetically programmed to hit every day. We will continue to eat, consuming unlimited amounts of fats and carbohydrates until that protein requirement is met. In a food environment dominated by ultra-processed foods that are high in calories but low in protein, this mechanism becomes a trap. We overeat calories in a desperate subconscious attempt to find the amino acids our bodies crave. By prioritizing protein, we hack this system, triggering satiety sooner and shutting down the drive to overconsume. The metabolic impact of protein extends far beyond simple appetite control. It fundamentally alters the energy equation of digestion. This is known as the thermic effect of food, TEF. Not all calories are created equal. When you eat fat, the body uses very little energy to process it, perhaps 2 to 3% of the calories consumed. Carbohydrates require about 5 to 10%. Protein, however, is metabolically expensive. The body must expend 20 to 30% of the calories in protein just to break it down into amino acids and assimilate them. This means that 100 calories of chicken breast yields a net gain of only about 75 calories to the body, while stimulating the metabolic rate in the process. For a person fighting the genetic tide of diabetes, this metabolic inefficiency is a massive advantage. A high-protein diet keeps the metabolic fire burning hotter, aiding in weight management and reducing the visceral fat accumulation that drives insulin resistance. Furthermore, protein is the primary stimulus for the release of the body's most potent satiety hormones, peptide YY and cholecystokinin. These hormones are released from the gut and travel directly to the hypothalamus in the brain, flipping the switch from hungry to full. At the same time, protein aggressively suppresses ghrelin,
The hunger hormone. This is why it is physically difficult to binge on boiled eggs or steak, while it is effortlessly easy to consume thousands of calories of potato chips or cookies. The chips do not signal the safety mechanisms, the protein does. In a preventative lifestyle, protein serves as the anchor of the meal. By centering the plate around a high-quality protein source, eggs, fish, lean meats, tofu, you are chemically programming your brain to be satisfied with less food overall. The relationship between protein and muscle mass is perhaps the most critical factor in long-term diabetes prevention. Type 2 diabetes is essentially a disease of carbohydrate intolerance, and skeletal muscle is the primary disposal site for glucose in the body. Roughly 80% of the glucose we consume is deposited into muscle tissue. Therefore, muscle is not just for strength, it is a metabolic organ. It is a glucose sink. The more active muscle tissue you have, the more room you have to store blood sugar safely. However, as we age, we naturally lose muscle mass, a condition called sarcopenia. This loss of muscle tissue shrinks the glucose sink, making us more susceptible to insulin resistance even if we don't gain fat. Dietary protein provides the essential amino acids, specifically leucine, required to trigger muscle protein synthesis, MPS. Without adequate protein, the body cannot maintain, let alone build, the muscle tissue required to buffer blood sugar. Prioritizing protein is therefore an act of protecting your body's glucose storage capacity. The timing of protein intake is as important as the total amount. The standard American diet is disastrously skewed. We consume a low-protein breakfast, cereal, toast, bagel, a low-protein lunch, sandwich, chips, and a massive protein load at dinner. This back-loaded distribution fails to stimulate muscle synthesis effectively throughout the day and leaves the individual riding a glucose roller coaster all morning and afternoon.
The investigative data points to breakfast as the critical intervention point. A high-protein breakfast, containing at least 30 grams of protein, stabilizes blood sugar and satiety hormones for the entire day. Studies have shown that individuals who consume a protein-rich breakfast experience significantly fewer cravings for sweets in the evening compared to those who eat a carbohydrate-heavy breakfast.
This is the physiological basis for the what to do instruction regarding nighttime cravings. Nighttime sugar cravings are rarely a sign of true hunger. They are often a sign of hedonic hunger, a brain seeking a dopamine hit, or a delayed reaction to a day of unstable blood sugar. However, they can also be a distress signal from a body that is amino acid deficient. The instruction to choose a protein snack instead of sweets interrupts the craving cycle. If you eat a cookie at 9 p.m., you spike blood sugar, crash while sleeping, and wake up with high cortisol and hunger, perpetuating the cycle. If you eat a piece of cheese, a hard-boiled egg, or Greek yogurt, you provide the body with slow digesting fuel. Casein, the primary protein in dairy, clots in the stomach and releases amino acids slowly over several hours, providing a steady stream of nutrients while you sleep. This supports overnight muscle repair and stabilizes morning blood sugar levels. The cultural shift required to prioritize protein is significant. It challenges the heart-healthy grain-based guidelines that dominated the late 20th century, guidelines that coincided with the explosion of obesity and diabetes. We were told to fear the egg and embrace the bagel. The investigation into these guidelines reveals that they were largely based on observational epidemiology that failed to account for the protective effects of protein and the damaging effects of refined starch. We must reclaim the center of the plate. This does not necessarily mean a carnivorous diet. Plant-based proteins like tofu, tempeh, lentils, and quinoa are effective, though they often require more volume to hit the same amino acid targets as animal products. The key is density and bioavailability. There is also a psychological component to protein prioritization. Protein is grounding. It is savory, umami, a taste profile that signals nourishment rather than the frenetic energy of sweetness. When we prioritize protein, we step off the blood sugar roller coaster. We stop being slaves to the next snack. The mental clarity that comes from stable blood sugar cannot be overstated. For a family with a history of diabetes, the hangry episodes, the post-lunch brain fog, and the desperate need for a mid-afternoon pick-me-up are all symptoms of metabolic dysfunction. Protein cures this volatility. In the final analysis, prioritizing protein is a strategy of fortification.
It builds the physical infrastructure, muscle, necessary to handle glucose. It creates the hormonal environment, satiety, necessary to maintain a healthy weight. It increases the metabolic cost of digestion, TEF, helping to burn excess energy. It is the bedrock upon which a diabetes-resistant body is built. By ensuring that every meal, and especially the first meal of the day, is anchored by this vital nutrient, we provide the body with the raw materials it needs to repair, regulate, and resist the onset of metabolic disease. We move from state of constant craving and storage to a state of satiety and structure.
5. Exercise consistently, 150 minutes per week, plus strength training. To comprehend the necessity of consistent exercise in the prevention of type 2 diabetes, one must first accept a radical redefinition of the human body. We are not anatomical structures designed to sit, we are kinetic machines engineered by millions of years of evolutionary pressure to move. The modern sedentary lifestyle is not merely a lack of activity, it is a deviation from our biological blueprint so profound that it constitutes a disease state in itself. When we investigate the mechanism of insulin resistance, we find that the skeletal muscle is the primary battlefield. Skeletal muscle is the largest organ in the human body, and crucially, it is the primary site of glucose disposal. Under normal physiological conditions, roughly 80% of the glucose consumed during a meal is destined to be stored in muscle tissue as glycogen. Therefore, the health, density, and activity level of your muscle tissue dictate your metabolic destiny. When a person with a family history of diabetes remains sedentary, they are effectively boarding up the windows and locking the doors of the very warehouse designed to store their energy. The prescription of 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity per week, coupled with strength training, is not an arbitrary figure plucked from thin air by public health officials. It is a calculated minimum effective dose derived from decades of epidemiological data and physiological stress testing. It represents the threshold at which the body's metabolic machinery switches from a state of stagnation to a state of maintenance. However, to truly appreciate the power of exercise, we must zoom into the molecular level, specifically to a protein transporter known as GLUT4. In a resting state, GLUT4 transporters remain dormant, hidden deep inside the muscle cell. They wait for insulin to knock on the cell surface receptor. When insulin binds, a signaling cascade is triggered, and GLUT4 moves to the surface to let glucose in. In a diabetic or pre-diabetic individual, this signaling pathway is broken. The doorbell rings, but no one answers. The glucose remains in the blood, rotting the vessels. This is where exercise performs its biochemical miracle. Muscle contraction, the physical act of moving and lifting, activates a completely separate pathway, primarily driven by an enzyme called AMPK, AMP-activated protein kinase. When you exercise, the energy status of the cell drops, and AMPK senses this change. It
It triggers the translocation of GLUT4 to the cell surface independent of insulin. This is a critical discovery. Exercise bypasses the broken insulin signaling pathway entirely. It opens the back door of the cell. For a person with insulin resistance, exercise is not just burning calories, it is a mechanical override of their defective genetics. Every time you contract a muscle, you are manually lowering your blood sugar, doing the job that your pancreas is struggling to manage. This effect can last for up to 48 hours after a workout, creating a metabolic afterburn where insulin sensitivity remains heightened. The inclusion of strength training in this protocol is paramount and represents a paradigm shift in diabetes prevention. For years, the focus was solely on aerobic activity, walking, jogging, cycling. While cardio is essential for mitochondrial health, increasing the number of cellular power plants that burn fat, strength training is about structural engineering. It is about building a bigger tank. If your muscles are the gas tank for glucose, strength training expands the capacity of that tank. As we age, we naturally succumb to sarcopenia, the involuntary loss of skeletal muscle mass. We lose approximately 3 to 5% of our muscle mass per decade after age 30. For someone genetically predisposed to diabetes, this is catastrophic. It means their glucose storage capacity is shrinking year by year, forcing more sugar to remain in the bloodstream or be shunted to the liver to be turned into fat. Resistance training halts and reverses this process. By lifting weights using resistance bands or performing bodyweight exercises, you stimulate muscle protein synthesis, hypertrophy. You are physically constructing new tissue to soak up the glucose. The distinction between physical activity and exercise is also worth a forensic examination. Physical activity includes all movement, fidgeting, walking to the car, gardening. Exercise is planned, structured, repetitive, and intentional movement intended to improve physical fitness. The 150-minute guideline targets the latter, but it relies on the foundation of the former. The weekend warrior model, sedentary for 5 days and active for 2, is insufficient for metabolic regulation. The gene expression changes that improve insulin sensitivity are transient. They fade within days. To keep the anti-diabetic gene switched on,
The stimulus must be consistent. This is why the recommendation emphasizes frequency. A daily 20-minute brisk walk is metabolically superior to a single 150-minute hike once a week because it provides a daily pulse of glucose clearance and insulin sensitization. However, the modern environment is engineered to eliminate exertion. We have escalators, elevators, remote controls, and delivery apps. We have successfully outsourced movement. To exercise consistently is to engage in a countercultural rebellion. It requires a deliberate restructuring of one's life to prioritize inefficiency. It means parking further away, taking the stairs, and carving out time in a schedule that resists it. The what to do instruction for the inactive, starting with 10 minutes, is rooted in behavioral psychology. The inertia of a sedentary life is a powerful physical force. The prospect of an hour-long gym session can induce paralysis, but 10 minutes is non-threatening. It bypasses the brain's fear response. Once the body is in motion, the friction of starting disappears. This is the momentum strategy. Biologically, even 10 minutes of movement stimulates blood flow, releases endorphins, and begins the process of glucose oxidation. We must also explore the role of myokines, a relatively new discovery in the field of exercise physiology. We now know that muscle is an endocrine organ. When it contracts, it secretes hundreds of peptide signaling molecules called myokines. One of the most famous is irisin, often dubbed the exercise hormone. Irisin travels through the blood to white fat cells, the bad storage fat, and triggers a process called browning, effectively turning them into beige fat cells that are more metabolically active and burn energy as heat. Irisin also travels to the brain to stimulate the growth of new neurons. In the context of diabetes, myokines act as anti-inflammatory agents, counteracting the systemic inflammation caused by visceral fat. They are the peacekeepers in the metabolic war. A sedentary body is silent. A moving body is chemically singing, sending signals of repair and regulation to the liver, the pancreas, and the brain. The 150-minute metric serves another crucial function. It targets visceral adiposity directly. While diet controls the input of energy, exercise controls the flux. Visceral fat is highly sensitive to catecholamines, adrenaline and noradrenaline released during exercise.
regular aerobic activity mobilizes these deep fat stores more efficiently than subcutaneous fat. You might not see the scale move immediately, but the internal composition is changing. You are draining the fat from the liver and pancreas, giving beta cells, the insulin producers, a chance to recover. This is the phenomenon of the metabolically healthy obese individual, a person who may carry excess weight, but due to high activity levels has normal insulin sensitivity and low visceral fat. Ultimately, consistent exercise is the most potent broad-spectrum drug we have. If it were a pill, it would be the most valuable pharmaceutical in history. It lowers blood pressure, improves lipid profiles, reduces anxiety, and sensitizes cells to insulin. For families with a history of type 2 diabetes, exercise is the non-negotiable variable. It is the daily maintenance required to keep a compromised machine running smoothly. It transforms the body from a stagnant swamp of glucose and inflammation into a flowing river of energy and renewal.
The instruction to increase gradually is a nod to sustainability. The goal is not to train for the Olympics. The goal is to train for longevity. It is to build a habit so ingrained that it becomes as automatic as brushing one's teeth, a daily hygiene practice for the metabolic system.
6. Walk after meals to lower blood sugar spikes. If consistent exercise is the strategic war against diabetes, walking after meals is the tactical hand-to-hand combat. This practice, often referred to in medical literature as postprandial ambulation, targets the most dangerous phase of the diabetic progression, the post-meal glucose spike. To understand why this specific timing is critical, we must investigate the postprandial state. In a healthy individual, blood sugar rises gently after a meal and returns to baseline within 2 hours. In an insulin-resistant individual, this curve is exaggerated. It shoots up violently and stays elevated for hours. This state of hyperglycemia is toxic. High blood sugar is not just a number, it is a physical abrasive. Glucose molecules are sharp and sticky. They tear at the delicate endothelial lining of the blood vessels, leading to heart disease, and bind to proteins in a process called glycation, leading to nerve damage and organ aging. The damage of diabetes happens largely in the hours after eating. The ancient wisdom of the Passeggiata in Italy, or the Chinese proverb, walk 100 steps after a meal and live to 99, has now been validated by the most advanced biosensors available, continuous glucose monitors, CGMs. These devices, which track blood sugar in real time, have visualized the profound impact of post-meal movement. Data shows that sitting after a meal creates a physiological traffic jam. The glucose enters the bloodstream from the gut, but because the muscles are dormant, there is nowhere for it to go. It piles up, forcing the pancreas to scream with insulin. However, initiating a walk within 15 to 30 minutes of finishing a meal changes the physics of the system entirely. The mechanism relies on the unique physiology of the lower body muscles, specifically the soleus and the gastrocnemius in the calves, and the massive quadriceps in the thighs. These muscles act as a second heart. When you walk, the rhythmic contraction of these muscles pumps venous blood back up to the heart, but more importantly, it sucks glucose out of the arterial blood. This is immediate extraction. Because the muscles are working, they consume the glucose as fuel the moment it arrives from the digestive tract. You are essentially matching the rate of glucose entry from digestion with the rate of glucose disposal from walking. The result is a flattening of the curve. Instead of a mountain peak, the blood sugar trace looks like a rolling hill. This reduction in glucose variability is arguably more important than lowering average blood sugar, as it is the spikes and drops that cause the most oxidative stress to the body. The timing, 10 to 20 minutes after the meal, is precise. This coincides with the start of the gastric emptying phase, where food moves from the stomach to the small intestine and glucose begins to hit the bloodstream. If you wait 2 hours, the spike has already occurred. The damage is done. By intervening immediately, you are intercepting the glucose. The duration of 10 to 20 minutes is also scientifically calibrated. You do not need a marathon. A short duration is sufficient to clear the acute load of glucose from a standard meal. If the meal was particularly heavy in carbohydrates, a carb loading event, a longer walk may be necessary, but for daily maintenance, the short walk is the golden standard of metabolic hygiene. This practice also addresses the active couch potato paradox. Research has shown that even people who go to the gym for an hour in the morning but sit for the rest of the day can still suffer from poor blood sugar control. The metabolic benefits of the morning workout fade as the day progresses. By distributing movement throughout the day, specifically anchoring it to mealtimes, you are providing correctional doses of movement exactly when the body needs them most. It transforms the act of eating from a passive event into an active cycle of fueling and burning. It recouples the biological link between energy intake and energy expenditure that modern life has severed. The what-to-do instruction for those who cannot go outside, pacing or gentle steps, highlights the mechanical nature of this intervention. You do not need fresh air or scenery for this to work. You need muscle contraction. The soleus push-up is a prime example of this. Recent studies have shown that doing seated calf raises, keeping the toe on the ground and lifting the heel, can significantly lower blood glucose and improve metabolism. The soleus muscle is unique. It is designed for endurance and runs on a mixture of fuels that makes it incredibly efficient at clearing blood sugar without fatiguing. Pacing around the living room, marching in place while watching TV, or doing household chores immediately after eating are all valid forms of postprandial therapy.
The goal is simply to prevent the body from entering a state of complete rest while it is flooded with energy. There is also a profound neurological component to walking after meals. Digestion is a parasympathetic process, the rest and digest system. However, heavy meals, especially those high in refined carbs, can trigger an excessive parasympathetic response, leading to the food coma or postprandial somnolence. This sluggishness is a sign of metabolic stress. Walking provides a mild sympathetic stimulus, the fight or flight system, that counteracts this slump. It keeps the mind alert and prevents the lethargy that leads to further inactivity. It creates a positive feedback loop. You eat, you walk, you feel energetic, you make better choices for the next meal. Conversely, the eat and sleep cycle creates a negative loop of lethargy, high blood sugar, and poor sleep quality. The cultural implications of this habit are significant. In many Western cultures, the post-dinner period is synonymous with the couch and the screen. We have normalized a lifestyle where the largest meal of the day is followed by the longest period of inactivity, sitting, then sleeping. This is the perfect storm for diabetes. The calories from dinner have nowhere to go but into visceral fat storage. By adopting the post-meal walk, we are reclaiming the evening. We are restructuring the social architecture of the family. Instead of bonding over television, the family bonds over a walk. This not only improves the metabolic health of the parents, but models a crucial survival skill for the children, breaking the intergenerational cycle of the disease. Furthermore, this practice acts as a natural appetite regulator for the rest of the evening. The dessert stomach phenomenon is often driven by the blood sugar crash that follows the initial spike. By smoothing out the curve with a walk, you prevent the reactive hypoglycemia that drives late-night snacking. You return from the walk with stable blood sugar and a sense of satiety, making it easier to fast until breakfast. It is a keystone habit that supports all the other habits on the list. In the final analysis, walking after meals is the most accessible, low-tech, and high-impact tool in the diabetes prevention arsenal. It requires no equipment, no gym membership, and no pharmaceutical intervention. It requires only the discipline to move. It is a recognition that the body handles food best when it is in motion.
For a person fighting a genetic predisposition to type 2 diabetes, the post-meal walk is the shield that deflects the daily arrows of dietary glucose. It turns the dangerous peaks of blood sugar into manageable waves, preserving the pancreas, protecting the blood vessels, and ensuring that the food we eat nourishes us rather than slowly destroying us from the inside out. It is the simple, rhythmic assertion of life over lethargy.
7. Sleep 7 to 9 hours on a consistent schedule. To investigate the origins of the type 2 diabetes epidemic, one typically looks to the pantry or the gym. However, the most insidious driver of metabolic dysfunction may not be what we eat or how we move, but what we do when we are unconscious. Sleep is the orphan of modern medicine, often neglected, frequently sacrificed, and culturally viewed as a passive state of rest that can be traded for productivity. This view is biologically catastrophic. Through the lens of advanced endocrinology, sleep is not a pause button. It is an active, high-energy state of metabolic repair and hormonal calibration. When we compromise sleep, we are not merely tired, we are inducing a state of temporary physiological chaos that mimics the metabolic profile of a diabetic. For a family genetically predisposed to insulin resistance, the modern habit of chronic sleep deprivation is akin to leaving the back door of a burning house open. It fans the flames of the disease with terrifying efficiency. The scientific evidence linking sleep deprivation to diabetes is irrefutable and alarming. In landmark studies conducted at the University of Chicago, healthy young men with no history of metabolic disease were restricted to 4 hours of sleep for just 6 nights. At the end of the week, their blood work was indistinguishable from that of pre-diabetic patients. Their ability to process glucose had plummeted by 40%. This creates a haunting realization. You can be a young, fit individual with a perfect diet, but if you are sleeping 4 hours a night, your body is chemically functioning as if it is aged and metabolically broken. This occurs because sleep loss triggers a massive release of cortisol, the stress hormone, which signals the body to hoard fat and dump sugar into the bloodstream. Simultaneously, the body becomes resistant to insulin, the hormone needed to clear that sugar. It is a perfect storm of metabolic sabotage. To understand why this happens, we must delve into the concept of circadian biology. Every cell in the human body possesses its own internal clock, a molecular timekeeper regulated by the master clock in the brain, the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This system evolved over billions of years to align our internal physiology with the external rotation of the planet, the cycle of light and dark. Insulin sensitivity is not a constant, it is a rhythm. We are designed to be insulin sensitive during the day.
When we are foraging and eating and insulin resistant at night, when we are fasting and sleeping. When we sleep erratically, stay up late, or expose ourselves to bright light at night, we desynchronize these clocks. We create a state of circadian misalignment. The pancreas, the liver, and the muscles are no longer singing from the same sheet music. The pancreas may release insulin when the muscles are not ready to receive it, leading to elevated blood sugar levels that persist throughout the night and into the next day. The hormonal disruption caused by poor sleep extends to the regulation of appetite itself, creating a vicious cycle that makes dietary compliance nearly impossible. Sleep regulates 2 critical hormones, ghrelin and leptin. Ghrelin is the hunger hormone, the signal that tells the brain to seek food. Leptin is the satiety hormone, the signal that tells the brain you are full. Under conditions of sleep deprivation, this system inverts. Ghrelin levels spike and leptin levels plummet. This is not a subtle shift, it is a primal drive. The brain, sensing a perceived energy crisis due to lack of rest, screams for high-calorie, quick-energy foods. This is the biological explanation for the midnight munchies, or the uncontrollable craving for donuts and bagels after a restless night. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for willpower and decision-making, is also impaired by lack of sleep. So you have a brain that is screaming for sugar, and a willpower center that is asleep at the wheel. For someone trying to prevent diabetes, fighting this hormonal tide is a losing battle. The foundation of dietary control is therefore a good night's sleep.
The what to do instruction regarding caffeine and screens touches on the primary environmental toxins of the 21st century, artificial stimulation and blue light. To protect blood sugar, we must protect melatonin. Melatonin is often thought of merely as a sleep aid, but it is also a metabolic hormone. It governs the timing of insulin secretion. The production of melatonin is strictly controlled by light. For 99% of human history, the only light available after sunset was the warm, low-intensity glow of a fire. Today, we stare into the high-intensity blue-spectrum light of smartphones, tablets, and LED televisions. This blue light hits the retina and sends a direct signal to the SCN that it is still noon. The brain suppresses melatonin production.
Delaying sleep onset and degrading sleep quality. This light pollution is a metabolic disruptor. It keeps the body in a state of daytime alertness, preventing the deep restorative stages of sleep, slow wave sleep, where glucose regulation is recalibrated. Caffeine acts as the chemical accomplice to this disruption. It is an adenosine antagonist. Adenosine is a chemical that builds up in the brain throughout the day, creating sleep pressure, the feeling of tiredness that helps us fall asleep. Caffeine blocks the receptors for adenosine, effectively masking the need for sleep. The danger lies in its pharmacokinetics. Caffeine has a half-life of approximately 5 to 7 hours. This means that if you consume a cup of coffee at 4 p.m., half of that caffeine is still active in your brain at 10 p.m. While you might be able to fall asleep, the presence of caffeine prevents the brain from entering the deepest phases of sleep. You wake up unrefreshed, reach for more caffeine and sugar to get through the day, and the cycle of insulin resistance tightens. Reducing late caffeine is not just about relaxing, it is about clearing the chemical architecture of the brain to allow for metabolic repair. The cultural investigation of sleep reveals a society that is fundamentally at war with its own biology. The invention of the light bulb by Thomas Edison was a triumph of engineering, but a disaster for the circadian rhythm. We have colonized the night, turning it into a time for work and entertainment. We wear our sleep deprivation as a badge of honor, a sign of our hustle and dedication. But the biological bill is coming due in the form of the diabetes epidemic. The correlation between the reduction in average sleep duration over the last 50 years from roughly 8.5 hours to under 7 hours tracks almost perfectly with the rise in obesity and type 2 diabetes. We are a species of chronobiological exiles, living in a time zone that does not exist in nature. Consistency is the final critical variable. The instruction to sleep on a consistent schedule addresses the phenomenon of social jet lag. Many people starve themselves of sleep during the work week and attempt to binge sleep on the weekends to catch up. Scientifically, this does not work. You cannot bank sleep. Furthermore, shifting your wake-up time by 3 or 4 hours on the weekend confuses the SCN, essentially giving your body jet lag every single week.
This constant shifting of the internal clock keeps the metabolic system in a state of permanent stress. To prevent diabetes, one must treat their bedtime with the same rigidity as a medication schedule. The body craves predictability. When the sleep-wake cycle is regular, the body learns to anticipate glucose needs, ramping up insulin sensitivity in the morning and winding it down in the evening with precision. Ultimately, sleep is the bedrock of health. Without it, the other 9 interventions on this list crumble. You cannot exercise effectively if you are exhausted. You cannot manage cravings if your ghrelin is sky high. You cannot manage stress if your cortisol is unregulated. Sleep is the time when the body takes out the metabolic trash, clearing the brain of toxins via the glymphatic system and resetting the insulin receptors on the cell surface. Prioritizing 7 to 9 hours of sleep is an act of defiance against a culture that demands 24/7 availability. It is a reclaiming of the biological rhythms that sustained our ancestors. For the family fighting the genetic specter of diabetes, the bedroom is not just a place of rest, it is a metabolic sanctuary, and the pillow is a medical device.
8. Manage stress to protect blood sugar. If sugar is the fuel for type 2 diabetes, stress is the lighter fluid. The connection between psychological stress and blood sugar is not merely anecdotal. It is a hardwired survival mechanism that dates back to our earliest origins on the African savanna. To understand this connection, we must investigate the fight or flight response. When a prehistoric human encountered a predator, the hypothalamus in the brain signaled the adrenal glands to release a torrent of stress hormones, primarily adrenaline and cortisol. The biological purpose of these hormones is singular and urgent: to mobilize energy. They signal the liver to dump its stored glucose, glycogen, into the bloodstream to fuel the muscles for a sprint to safety. In a survival situation, this sugar spike saves your life. You run, you fight, you burn the sugar, and the hormones subside. The system resets. The modern investigative context, however, reveals a catastrophic mismatch between this ancient mechanism and our contemporary environment. Today, our predators are not lions. They are emails, traffic jams, mortgage payments, and 24-hour news cycles. We are living in a state of chronic, low-grade stress. The brain, unable to distinguish between a physical threat and a psychological one, triggers the same biological response. It dumps glucose into the bloodstream to help you fight the email, but you do not run. You sit at your desk. The glucose floods the system, but the muscles are idle. The pancreas, detecting this high sugar, releases insulin to store it, but here
here lies the twist. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, actively inhibits insulin. It makes the cells resistant to insulin because it wants the sugar to remain in the blood for the brain and muscles to use during the emergency. The result is a paradox: high blood sugar and high insulin, circulating in a body that is going nowhere. This is the exact biochemical recipe for type 2 diabetes. The specificity of cortisol's action on fat storage is particularly damning for those with a family history of diabetes. Cortisol does not just cause general weight gain, it acts like a traffic controller, directing fat storage specifically to the visceral area, the deep belly fat. The omental fat tissue in the abdomen has 4 times more cortisol receptors than subcutaneous fat. When you are stressed,
your body packs fat around your liver and pancreas as a quick access energy reserve for the next battle. As we established in entry number 1, this visceral fat is the engine of insulin resistance. Thus, chronic stress creates a physical architecture, the stress belly, that perpetuates the disease even if the diet is relatively clean. You can eat broccoli and chicken, but if your life is a high-stress emergency, your liver is pumping sugar into your blood as if you were eating candy. The behavioral component of stress, the stress eating phenomenon, adds another layer to this trap. Stress depletes the brain's dopamine reserves. To compensate, the brain seeks the fastest, most potent source of dopamine available: hyperpalatable foods rich in sugar and fat. This is not a failure of character, it is a neurochemical drive. We reach for comfort food because sugar actually dampens the cortisol response temporarily. It is a form of self-medication. However, this creates a vicious cycle. The sugar crash that follows leads to more stress, more cortisol, and more cravings. Breaking this cycle requires a disruption of the stress response itself rather than just resisting the food. This brings us to the what to do intervention: deep breathing and the physiology of the vagus nerve. The autonomic nervous system has 2 branches: the sympathetic, fight or flight, and the parasympathetic, rest and digest. They function like a seesaw. When one is up, the other is down. Chronic stress keeps the sympathetic system pinned to the ceiling. The vagus nerve is the primary controller of the parasympathetic system. It runs from the brainstem down to the heart, lungs, and crucially, the digestive organs. We cannot think our way out of stress, but we can breathe our way out. Deep diaphragmatic breathing, slow rhythmic breathing where the belly expands, physically stimulates the vagus nerve. This sends a signal to the brain that the threat is over. Heart rate slows, cortisol drops, and digestion resumes. The recommendation to use a 5-minute breathing routine is a form of biohacking. It is a manual override of the stress response. By taking 5 minutes to breathe deeply, inhaling for 4 counts, holding for 4, and exhaling for 8, you are flipping the chemical switch from emergency to maintenance. In this state, the liver stops dumping glucose, insulin sensitivity returns, and the body can process the meal you just ate.
This is why stress management is not a luxury or a soft science. It is a hard metabolic intervention. A stressed body is a diabetic body in waiting. The historical trajectory of stress in the Western world parallels the rise of industrialization and the dissolution of community structures. We have moved from communal, physical living to isolated, cerebral living. The type A personality, driven, hostile, impatient, was identified in the 1950s as a risk factor for heart disease, but it is equally a risk factor for diabetes. The glorification of busyness has created a culture where high cortisol is viewed as a proxy for importance. We wear our stress as a status symbol, but the pancreas does not care about your status, it cares about homeostasis. The constant bombardment of stress hormones exhausts the beta cells of the pancreas, hastening their failure. The what to do instruction also mentions short walks and stretching. These are physical outlets for the mobilized energy. If stress mobilizes sugar for a fight, a short walk burns that sugar off, completing the biological cycle. It tricks the body into thinking you have escaped the predator. This resolves the stress response physically. Stretching helps to release the muscular tension that signals danger to the brain. It is a somatic approach to mental health. Managing stress also involves a rigorous audit of one's environment and boundaries. It means learning to say no, reducing exposure to alarming media, and cultivating micro moments of calm. It involves a shift in perspective, recognizing that very few modern stressors are actually life-threatening. The Stoic philosophy, differentiating between what we can control and what we cannot, becomes a tool for blood sugar management. If you worry about things you cannot control, you are paying a physiological tax on them in the form of elevated glucose. Future predictions suggest that stress management will become a central pillar of personalized medicine. We are already seeing the rise of wearable technology that tracks heart rate variability, a key metric of stress and recovery. High HRV indicates a resilient, adaptable nervous system. Low HRV indicates chronic stress and metabolic fragility. In the near future, preventing diabetes will likely involve real-time biofeedback, where your watch alerts you that your stress levels are spiking and guides you through a breathing exercise before you eat.
Preventing the cortisol-insulin collision. Ultimately, managing stress to protect blood sugar is about reclaiming the body from the grip of the modern world. It is about understanding that peace of mind is not just a psychological state, it is a metabolic necessity. For the family with a genetic tendency toward diabetes, the home must be a low cortisol zone. Laughter, connection, rest, and deep breathing are not just pleasant activities, they are potent anti-diabetic medicines that tell the ancient genome that it is safe, that the famine is not coming, and that the predator has passed.
9. Choose water over sugary drinks. To investigate the single greatest catalyst of the modern diabetes epidemic, one must look past the solid food on the plate and examine the liquid in the glass. The consumption of sugary beverages represents a profound deviation from human evolutionary biology, a nutritional experiment conducted on a global scale with catastrophic results. For millions of years, the only liquid mammals consumed after weaning was water. The human metabolic system is engineered to hydrate with neutral, calorie-free fluid. The introduction of liquid sugar in the form of sodas, sweetened teas, energy drinks, and fruit juices has short-circuited our satiety mechanisms and flooded our livers with a toxic payload that drives insulin resistance with terrifying efficiency. Choosing water over sugary drinks is not merely a dietary preference, it is the removal of a metabolic poison that is uniquely designed to bypass the body's natural defenses. The danger of liquid sugar lies in its stealth. When you consume solid food, the physical distension of the stomach and the chemical composition of the nutrients trigger a complex cascade of satiety hormones, including peptide YY and cholecystokinin. These signals travel to the brain to say, "Stop eating." Liquid calories, however, are essentially invisible to this system. You can consume 500 calories of soda, the equivalent of a substantial meal, and your brain will register almost zero satiety. You remain physically hungry. This is the vanishing calorie effect. Consequently, these calories are not subtracted from your daily intake, they are added on top of it. In a family prone to diabetes, this caloric surplus does not just lead to weight gain, it leads to a specific type of visceral fat accumulation that strangles the organs. We must conduct a forensic analysis of the primary culprit within these drinks, fructose. Most sugary beverages are sweetened with high fructose corn syrup, or sucrose, which is 50% fructose. Unlike glucose, which can be utilized by every cell in the body for energy, fructose can only be processed by the liver. When you drink a large soda, you are hitting the liver with a tsunami of fructose that it cannot possibly use for immediate energy. It has no choice but to activate a metabolic pathway called de novo lipogenesis, the creation of new fat.
This fat is not stored subcutaneously. It is stored within the liver cells themselves, steatosis, and exported as very low-density lipoprotein, the bad cholesterol. This fatty liver is the ground zero of insulin resistance. By drinking sugary beverages, you are essentially marinating your liver in fat, rendering it deaf to insulin signals. The speed of absorption adds to the lethality. Liquid sugar requires no digestion. It passes through the stomach and into the small intestine with frightening velocity. This results in a blood sugar spike that is sharper and higher than almost any solid food can produce. This spike demands a massive immediate release of insulin from the pancreas. Over time, these repeated insulin hammers exhaust the beta cells of the pancreas, leading to their dysfunction and eventual death. The transition from metabolically healthy to type 2 diabetic is often paved with the empty aluminum cans of sugary sodas. The investigation into the beverage industry reveals a calculated effort to increase the bliss point of these drinks, the precise amount of sweetness that maximizes pleasure without becoming cloying, thereby hijacking the brain's dopamine reward system and creating a dependency that rivals narcotics. Water, by contrast, is the metabolic solvent. It is the medium in which all cellular chemistry occurs. For a diabetic or pre-diabetic individual, hydration is a critical functional tool for glucose management. When blood sugar is high, the body attempts to excrete the excess glucose through the kidneys. This process requires water. If the body is dehydrated, the kidneys cannot effectively filter the sugar, and blood glucose concentration remains elevated. Furthermore, dehydration triggers the release of vasopressin, a hormone that helps the body retain water. Crucially, vasopressin also stimulates the liver to release stored sugar into the blood. Thus, simply being dehydrated can raise your blood sugar. By replacing sugary drinks with water, you are not only removing the toxin, you are adding the antidote. You are expanding the blood volume, diluting the glucose concentration, and supporting the kidney's filtration efforts. The cultural history of this shift is stark. In the mid-20th century, a soda was a 6.5-ounce treat consumed occasionally. Today, the standard serving size is 20 ounces, and big gulp culture has normalized the consumption of liters of sugar water daily. We have normalized a pathology.
The marketing of these drinks often associates them with vitality, sports, and happiness, masking the biological reality that they are metabolic depressants. The fruit juice myth is perhaps the most dangerous deception. Because it comes from fruit, many families believe juice is healthy. However, juice is simply soda with vitamins. The fiber, the protective matrix, has been removed, leaving only the sugar. A glass of orange juice contains as much sugar as a glass of cola and hits the liver with the same fructose load. For prevention, fruit should be eaten, never drunk. The what to do instruction, reduce slowly week by week, acknowledges the reality of addiction. Sugar triggers neuroadaptation in the brain. Suddenly removing it can cause genuine withdrawal symptoms, headaches, irritability, and intense cravings. The brain panics when its dopamine source is cut off.
A tapering strategy works by slowly lowering the threshold of sweetness that the palate expects. If you dilute your juice with 50% water for a week, your taste buds adjust. If you switch from sweet tea to half sweet, then to unsweetened with lemon, you are retraining your sensory system. Over time, the hypersweetness of a full soda becomes repulsive rather than desirable. This is palate rehabilitation. We must also consider the role of water in thermogenesis. Drinking cold water forces the body to expend energy to warm the fluid to body temperature. While this caloric burn is modest, in the context of a sedentary lifestyle, every metabolic advantage counts. Moreover, water acts as a mechanical appetite suppressant. The stomach has stretch receptors that signal fullness. Filling the stomach with water before a meal activates these receptors, curbing hunger and reducing caloric intake. This is the simplest, cheapest, and most effective diet pill in existence. The environmental cues for drinking water must be engineered. We drink what is available. If the refrigerator is stocked with soda, we drink soda. If we carry a water bottle, we drink water. The prevention strategy requires a logistical change, the physical removal of sugary drinks from the home. It is a declaration of a sugar-free zone. This protects the family not just from the calories, but from the constant visual cue to consume them. It shifts the default behavior from pathology to health. Choosing water is also a rejection of the acidic state of modern nutrition. Sugary drinks,
particularly colas containing phosphoric acid, are highly acidic. The body must buffer this acidity to maintain a stable blood pH, often by leaching minerals from the bones. In contrast, water is neutral. Lemon water, mentioned in the protocol, has an alkalinizing effect after digestion and contains citrate, which can help prevent kidney stones, a common complication of metabolic syndrome. The addition of lemon or unsweetened tea provides the variety and flavor that the modern palate craves without the metabolic cost. In the final analysis, the switch to water is the single most effective lever to pull in diabetes prevention. You can change nothing else, keep the same diet, the same activity level, and simply swapping soda for water can result in significant weight loss and improved insulin sensitivity. It eliminates the most egregious insult to the liver. It stops the daily cycle of spike and crash. It clears the mental fog associated with blood sugar fluctuations. For a family fighting a genetic legacy of diabetes, the water bottle is a symbol of resistance. It represents a return to biological sanity, a cleansing of the system, and a refusal to participate in the industrial experiment that has sickened a generation.
10. Get regular checkups, fasting glucose, and HbA1c. The final entry in this investigative protocol addresses the most terrifying characteristic of type 2 diabetes, its silence. This disease does not announce itself with a trumpet blast. It creeps in like a thief in the night. You can lose 50% of your pancreatic beta cell function before you ever feel a single symptom. You can walk around for a decade with insulin resistance, feeling fine, while your internal organs are slowly being candied by excess sugar. By the time symptoms appear, excessive thirst, frequent urination, blurred vision, the metabolic house is already on fire. Therefore, relying on how you feel is a fatal error. To prevent type 2 diabetes, you must move from subjective feeling to objective data. You must measure the monster to defeat it. The regular checkup is the reconnaissance mission in this war. However, we must deepen our understanding of what these tests actually measure. The standard fasting plasma glucose (FPG) test is a snapshot. It tells you what your blood sugar is at that exact moment in time. While useful, it has severe limitations. Your body is incredibly adept at homeostasis. It will fight tooth and nail to keep fasting blood sugar in a normal range, under 100 milligrams per deciliter, even if it has to pump out massive amounts of insulin to do so. A person can have a normal fasting glucose reading while their pancreas is redlining, working at 200% capacity to mask the problem. Relying solely on fasting glucose can give a false sense of security, missing the early stages of the disease by years. This is why the hemoglobin A1c, HbA1c test is the gold standard for long-term surveillance. To understand HbA1c, we must understand the chemistry of glycation. Hemoglobin is the protein in your red blood cells that carries oxygen. Glucose is a sticky molecule. When it floats in the bloodstream, it occasionally bumps into hemoglobin and sticks to it, like a barnacle on a ship's hull. This process is irreversible. Since a red blood cell lives for approximately 3 months, 90 to 120 days, measuring the percentage of hemoglobin that is sugar-coated gives us a weighted average of your blood sugar over the last quarter. It is a truth serum. You cannot cheat the A1c test by eating a salad the night before. It reveals the late-night binges, the stress-induced spikes, and the daily baseline. An A1c below 5.7% is normal. 5.7 to 6.4% is prediabetes. 6.5% and above is diabetes.
However, the deep dive investigation suggests we should go even further. The most forward-thinking prevention strategy involves testing insulin itself. A fasting insulin test can reveal metabolic dysfunction long before glucose or A1C rise. This is the concept of the Kraft curve. Joseph Kraft, a pathologist who performed thousands of glucose tolerance tests with insulin assays, discovered that many people with normal blood sugar had sky-high insulin levels. This is hyperinsulinemia. It is the body's desperate attempt to compensate for resistance. Detecting high fasting insulin is the earliest possible warning sign, the canary in the coal mine. If you have a family history, asking your doctor for a fasting insulin test, aiming for a result under 5 to 7 UIU/mL, provides a decade of lead time to intervene. The concept of prediabetes requires a radical reframing. The medical community often treats prediabetes as a watch and wait zone. This is dangerous. Prediabetes is not a waiting room, it is early stage disease. At an A1C of 5.8%, damage to the retina and the nerves is already beginning. The risk of heart attack and stroke is already elevated. The instruction to follow a 3-month lifestyle plan and retest is a call to immediate, aggressive action. The diagnosis of prediabetes is a gift. It is a moment of clarity where the disease is still fully reversible through lifestyle changes alone, without the need for lifelong medication. It is the cliff edge where you can still turn the car around. The What to Do section emphasizes the feedback loop. Testing is useless without action, and action is blind without testing. The 3-month cycle is critical because it aligns with the lifespan of the red blood cell. It takes about 90 days to see the full impact of dietary changes on the A1C score. This creates a gamified structure for health. You implement the changes, cutting sugar, walking after meals, listing weights, and then you get the scorecard from the lab. Seeing the number drop from 6.1% to 5.6% provides a massive psychological reinforcement. It proves that your biology is not your destiny. It is responsive to your behavior. We are also standing on the precipice of a technological revolution in diagnostics, the continuous glucose monitor, CGM. Once reserved for type 1 diabetics, these wearable sensors are becoming available to the general public.
A CGM involves a tiny filament inserted under the skin of the arm that measures interstitial fluid glucose every few minutes, beaming the data to a smartphone. This is the ultimate tool for prevention. It provides a movie of your metabolism rather than a snapshot. You can see exactly how your body reacts to a banana versus a cookie, or how stress spikes your sugar during a meeting. It personalizes the protocol. For many, seeing the real-time line spike after a soda is the visceral shock needed to change behavior permanently. It closes the gap between cause and effect. The regular checkup also serves as a checkpoint for other components of metabolic syndrome, specifically blood pressure and lipid panels. Type 2 diabetes rarely travels alone. It travels in a pack with hypertension and dyslipidemia, high triglycerides, low HDL. This cluster of conditions is driven by the same root cause, insulin resistance. Tracking triglycerides is particularly revealing. High triglycerides are essentially a proxy for high carbohydrate intake and insulin resistance. A ratio of triglycerides to HDL, trig/HDL, of over 2.0 is a strong predictor of metabolic risk. The psychological barrier to testing is the ostrich effect, the desire to bury one's head in the sand to avoid bad news. This fear is understandable but lethal. In the context of a family history, ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance is amputation, blindness, and kidney failure. Knowledge is power. By getting checked, you are taking ownership of your genetic narrative. You are shifting from a passive victim of heredity to an active manager of your physiology. The future of diabetes prevention lies in this quantified self-movement. We are moving away from the era of paternalistic medicine, where the doctor holds the keys, to an era of participatory medicine, where the patient holds the data. The checkup is no longer a judgment day, it is a strategy session. It is the moment where you calibrate your tactics against the enemy. In conclusion, getting regular checkups is the governance structure of the entire prevention plan. It validates the effort you put into the diet, the exercise, and the sleep. It catches the drift before it becomes a slide. It transforms the vague anxiety of "it runs in the family" into a concrete, manageable set of data points. By monitoring fasting glucose, HbA1c, and ideally insulin, you shine a spotlight into the dark corners of your metabolism.
Ensuring that diabetes has nowhere to hide and nowhere to grow. You secure your future not by hoping for the best, but by measuring the reality.